ultimately as the people who enforce them and the willingness of Americans to embrace them. So we have hurdles yet to be crossed.
Dan, people around the world hearing this news today may be surprised that it was legal to fire someone for being gay, even as recent as yesterday. I mean, isn't America supposed to be the country where these kinds of protections serve as role models for the rest of the world?
It certainly is. And, as a former diplomat, I used to spend a lot of time working on a range of human rights issues with partners and sometimes less than partners overseas. And one of the things, obviously, that cheapens our voice abroad is when we aren't living up to our standards at home. So I think, Chris Murphy, senator from Connecticut, had a piece come out in Foreign Affairs today that was largely about the protests related to the Black Lives Matter movement, in which I've been participating and many others have across the country, and talking about how this new push for civil rights is really good for the United States and our leadership in the world. And I strongly agree with him. And I think the decision today also helps on that front.
Let me pick up on this. We've seen, 21 days in a row of protests across the U.S., people demanding an end to racism and police brutality. Dan, and I'll ask Annise, both of you this. Speak to me about how these things fit together. I mean, did the 1964 Civil Rights Act, did it become a law that the country then ignored for the next 50 years? What do you say, Dan?
No, the country didn't. It had a serious impact. That said, as Mayor Parker alluded to, even though it has been widely accepted as outlawing discrimination based on whether somebody is a man or a woman, we know that there is still sexism in the workplace, that there is still gender discrimination in pay, et cetera, in the United States, and that remains a problem that needs to be addressed through the enforcement of these kinds of laws. But I do think there is an overlap in the decision that came down today and the protests that are going on around the country. Yesterday, in a number of cities, including here in Denver, there were protests that united, in some sense, the protests that are associated with Pride with the Black Lives Matter movement. The chants yesterday here in Denver were trans Black Lives Matter. And, I think it's really important for us to recognize that many times it's the protests that start the movement that helps people enlarge their vision and be able to see in laws the principles that our country was founded on and make those principles apply to everybody who counts as human, which is to say every person in this country. And so I think, one of the things that was interesting about the decision that came down today, you mentioned that it was authored by one of the conservative justices that President Trump appointed, this Gorsuch, and he took a strict textual reading of the law. He said the text of the law is clear and that discrimination against LGBTQ people is unlawful under this law. And while I am glad that that's what he saw in the law, and I agree with him, I think that he wouldn't have been able to see that were it not for the movement of so many over so many decades. And I think that's a good reminder of the importance of what we're doing right now across the country.
Annise, what do you say to how these two things maybe are feeding off each other? I mean, do you think that the movement, the protests against police brutality, against racism, will it be strengthened by today's Supreme Court ruling?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know whether that will be strengthened by this ruling. What I believe is that we're at a pivot point in American history and American politics where so many different strains of activism and intersectionality are coming together, and people from across the political spectrum and people from different communities are saying we want an America that recognizes the inherent worth and dignity of each of us, and we want the institutions of American life to respect that as well. As I said earlier, this is a ruling about employment, which is absolutely critical because in order to have the dignity of work, to support ourselves, to be able to put food on the table in an America that doesn't always respect all of us, this is a huge step forward, but there's still more work to do. And as Dan said, the protests are important because they draw attention, they expose the anger and the hurt and the frustration, but they don't solve things. What we need is now formal legislation to take this ruling and make sure that it permeates throughout our American employment system. And then, again, still areas where discrimination happens that we need to address. We need a comprehensive policy at the federal level to protect the LGBTQ community from discrimination in all aspects of our lives.
Okay, we've got about 1 minute left. I'll ask both of you. I'll start with you, Annise. Are you satisfied with the cooperation that is taking place between the LGBT community and Black Lives Matter, for example, or should these communities be working together more?
At this moment, the most important thing is to recognize that Black Lives Matter and to allow Black community to stand up and speak out about what they need. But we can always work more closely together.
And Dan?
I agree. I mean, I think what many of us are trying to do is figure out how we can learn from, listen to, and amplify the messages of Black and brown voices around the country. One of the things that is a crucial emergency right now is the attacks on Black trans women. We have seen a number of murders this year. This is a growing problem, and I think one of the things that we can all speak out about is the need for people to be safe in their bodies. And so, the lives of Black trans women matter. And we can say that, and the LGBTQ movement and the Black Lives Matter movement should be working together. We're working for a common cause.
Okay. Annise Parker, former mayor of Houston, Texas, CEO of the Gay and Lesbian Victory Fund, and Dan Baer with the Carnegie Endowment and former U.S. ambassador to the OSCE. To both of you, thank you very much. We